I'm going to spend a few minutes reflecting on some of the stuff that's happened in the last few hours. It's almost like there's a timing to this. Some of the studies that I've been doing recently have given me some new language and some new ways to demonstrate to you what's going on. And it's not so much the what. Everybody knows what the what is. It's the why and the how that is absolutely fascinating. I'm becoming an expert. The problem is my expertise will only last as long as I can remember it. Here's some of the background.
And the big question now, Megan, is how do you suspend the Duck Commander Phil Robertson and not lose A&E's biggest show altogether? The network released a statement, A&E saying in part, and I'm quoting here, his personal views in no way reflect those of A&E networks, who have always been strong supporters and champions of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. Robertson, like many devout Christians, believes that homosexuality is a sin. He told GQ magazine that homosexuals, like adulterers, thieves, drunkards, would not inherit the kingdom of God. He also says, in essence, that it's not logical for a man to prefer a man's body over a woman's. He did not, as some have reported, equate homosexuality with bestiality. He did say this, quoting, "Everything is blurred on what's right and what's wrong. Sin becomes fine. Start with homosexual behavior and just morph out from there. Bestiality, sleeping around with this woman and that woman and that woman and those men." Gay and lesbian advocates and defenders, or GLAAD, says that flies in the face of what true Christians believe. They say, quoting in part, "Phil's decision to push vile and extreme stereotypes is a stain on A&E and his sponsors, who now need to re-examine their ties to someone with such public disdain for LGBT people and their families." Phil Robertson released a statement through A&E that says, again quoting here, "I would never treat anyone with disrespect just because they are different from me. We are all created by the Almighty, and like him, I love all of humanity." Keep in mind, this Duck Dynasty family has plenty of money, and they are a very tight-knit group. The question now becomes, will they just pack up and leave A&E altogether? And you can expect to get some pushback from the Christian community on this as well.
All right, so that's the basic thing. If you're not a Duck Dynasty fan, you'll have no idea what's going on. But the patriarch of the family is Phil Robertson. He's the Dynasty guys. Those are the guys that have the semi-reality. It's all a comedy. It's just a delightful scam. It is a bunch of guys pretending to be Hicks and are way more sophisticated than they're letting on. But it's a hugely successful show. More than 9 million people watch this thing from time to time, and they've been on several seasons. And the patriarch was asked, and I don't know why he was even talking to GQ magazine. It seems a little suspect to me, but they pulled him into this category, and he just told what they thought. Well, the blowback from the gay lobby, which loves to blow back and loves to be offended and loves to assert itself, and this is their tactic. They, of course, blowed up, and A&E buckled right away, which is probably their tactic, too, and they suspended this fellow. I was watching one of the Fox talking heads last night, and Megyn Kelly is the person, and she had a little panel sitting there. And Bernard Whitman this is how he describes himself. This is how he views himself, as a double minority.
You know, Megan, as a double minority, I'm both gay and Jewish. I'm very sensitive to the plight of people who are persecuted for who they are or what they believe, particularly when it has a government stamp of approval.
So he's a double minority, a gay and a Jew. He's also a Democrat Party operative and pollster for them. But I'm going to challenge both of his assumptions, and I'm going to introduce you to a new word. He's a deracinated Jew. I'll tell you what that means here in just a moment. And the gay is not a minority. It's a behavior. They aspire to minority status, and they've been successful. But those of us who are paying attention out here, the cheap seats, think it's an absurd proposition to grant minority status to a behavior. And that is the only thing that Mr. Robertson was talking about, behavior. He mentioned nothing about status, and the status aspiration is a scam. Deracinated, what is that mean? That means severed from its roots, its base, rootless, alienated from your own roots, severed from your own roots. Typical Americans now are deracinated. We are severed from our roots, our Christian roots, and our constitutional roots and limited government roots. We have most of the people who live in the United States have no clue what the gifts that we were given as we entered a nation state, because we have been severed from our history. We are, as a culture, and race doesn't mean ethnicity here. I'm not talking about racial groups, but deracinated, to be uprooted, eradicated, alienated from your native base. So the fellow who identifies himself as a gay Jew, he's serving up self-canceling propositions like a Christian homosexual. If you say I'm a Christian pedophile, you should say it that way, Christian pedophile, or I am a Christian socialist. That's a contradiction in terms. And I'll give you another example. Let's just move this out of the field of sexuality here for a second. In the middle of the 1800s, there was a fellow by the name of Edward Bellamy. He was a socialist. His cousin, Francis Bellamy, was, for a while, a Baptist minister. And the people in his church noticed that he was a Baptist preacher who denied the deity of Christ. You say, yeah, I'm a Baptist minister, but that Christ guy, I don't think he's God. Well, you sort of have to believe that to be a Christian, so they defrocked him and kicked him out of the church. He was the guy that wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. And you know the one we used to say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States, yada, 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 yada. Well, he wrote that as a defrocked Baptist socialist in order to get all of those people who had just been recaptured by the Union Army and brought back into the United States under power of gun. And he says, I want to make those kids, the kids of those people, swear an allegiance. When they go to school, I pledge allegiance and indivisible. Remember? Under God was added later. So it's ultimately ironic that a bunch of Christians who take their oaths seriously pledge to stand up and take an oath that was written by a socialist, defrocked Baptist preacher, and we feel as if we're abused in some way if the kids can't repeat that stuff. But anyway, deracinated in that case, Bellamy. Severed from his roots, severed from the limited government assumptions of his own constitution, and severed from his faith when he denied it as a Baptist preacher. Deracinated as a Jew that says he's gay, in essence doing the same thing, denying the terms of his own stated law in the Torah. So he's running a hustle, is what I'm saying. It's a scam. And so he uses that position to heap abuse upon Mr. Robertson.
No, I thought it was disgusting, reprehensible, hateful. The fact that someone would equate the love I might have for another man with bestiality or a drunkard or adultery or something like this is certainly flies in the face of what it means to be Christian. What it means to be Christian.
So in essence, you've got a guy who is a deracinated Jew. He's severed from his own religion. Now he's lecturing Christians on what Christian ethics should be. Well, that's a target-rich environment.
The fact that this guy would come out and vilify an entire group of people for...
that's a scam. He didn't vilify a group. That's the aspirational scam that the gay lobby's running. He was talking about the behavior of individuals. The group is aspirational. That's politics. Robertson was talking about behavior. And he said, and to get to some point that you say, oh, people who disagree with me, I believe in freedom unless they disagree with me.
By God, let him do it, but it shouldn't have to be in the public square where people have to tune in and see that
what
sort
about
of...
his...
You don't tune in on cable. It's not the public airwaves. He says it over and over. Oh, you shouldn't be able to use the public airways. Well, it's not public airways. It's A&E. You can't tune in to it. It's not over the air. You have to buy a subscription in order to get A&E. It's not the public airways. It doesn't belong to the public. It belongs to A&E, which, by the way, has the right to fire Mr. Robertson. But it's... here's where he says the airwaves.
You can have your private beliefs, but they don't have to be aired on the public networks.
Okay.
There's no such thing as a public network. It's these are all owned by individuals and paid for by subscribers. And the guy says you can have your beliefs just as long as you don't share them. And I'm thinking that is pretty much what the First Amendment is there to guarantee, that you do not have to be consigned to the privacy of your house in order to have an opinion. So there isn't a single thing this guy is saying that has even a squirt of truth to it. The guy's a lying sack of shinola. And he's running the playbook. I'm just getting started here. I'm going to take a short time out here. This deracinator thing is fascinating. And what is going on with Robertson? How did this happen? I've got an example from history for you. A brief time out, back in a moment at 1040 WHO. If you'll pardon me, I have a lot to say about this, and it won't be the typical cliches you're going to be served up by the, quote, fair and balanced people who are just using the occasion to have put two people on both sides and have them yell at each other. That's not fair. It's not balanced. It's just plain stupid. And no analysis is going on besides, so you ought to have the right, you ought to have the freedom, and you put two sides on this, and they're considered equal combatants on an equal basis in a culture war squabble, and that's also a scam. The majority of our culture is on the side of Mr. Robertson. I can say that after year of being in the public eye, and the opposition to what he has to say is a tiny but powerful, noisy minority. And they have gotten away with what they've gotten away with by being bullies and lying. And they have guilted out a whole generation of Americans out of their own culture. And they used psychological warfare to do it. And they didn't invent it. I've been studying this a while, and I've got a couple of extraordinarily good examples for you as I can demonstrate this. This is fascinating. I'm going to give you history and analysis that you probably, unless you were studying right alongside me, reading the same stuff, you may not have put together. I'm not going to have time in this segment to do all of it, but I can get started here in a little bit. There's a really interesting soundbite that I was reading the other day in a book by Eliana Mercer, by a French writer, Louis Villot. He says, when I'm weaker, I ask you for my freedom, because that's your principle. But when I'm stronger, I will take away your freedom, because that's my principle. That's the shorthand for everything that you've just heard. But I'm going to give you, I'll flesh this out for you. I think you might be stunned by this. If you have a little more patience with me, I'll get to it right after the news. And then we're going to talk with Matt Schultz, Secretary of State, and then Jim Rickards, money expert, a little bit after 11.
WHO. Views expressed are those of hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of News Radio 1040 WHO.
Continuing here in just a moment, I got to hustle. I got so much to do here today. We're going to talk later with Matt Schultz, Secretary of State Schultz, about his quest to find and hold accountable people who voted illegally here in the state of Iowa in the last couple of election cycles. We're also going to talk with Jim Rickards, Currency Wars, telling you about what to expect out of the Fed and Fed policy and the meaning of your money. We're also talking this morning, a new word, deracinated, during the last hour. Another new word I was just handed, duckophobia. Duckophobia. There's going to be a lot of this stuff in the next several days. We're talking about the aftermath of A&E's capitulating to the gay lobby when Phil Robertson expressed his Christian theology about homosexuality. And I'm explaining to you the techniques and tactics. I will tell you more about that here in just a few moments. But Jennifer would like in on the conversation. Jennifer, good morning. How you doing?
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great.
I'm doing good, too. Actually, I wanted to tell you that I've been listening to your program ever since I turned 40. I don't know, something happened to me, and I started listening to talk radio.
I can tell you. I can explain that, by the way. Seriously, there is a physiological explanation. Because before 40, you were stimulating other glands.
Is that it? Because I don't know what happened.
And after 40, people want to stimulate the largest and most important one, the one between their ears.
Well, I don't think I fit the normal demographic of your typical listener. I am a conservative, spiritual but not Christian lesbian. And I'm calling in to talk to you about Phil.
Okay.
I am a huge Duck Dynasty fan, huge.
Right.
I'm even sporting the shirt today just because in my support. And I posted something. I was so upset about this.
It's a camouflage shirt?
Nope, it just says Duck Dynasty,
all right.
And it has a picture of all of them. In my spiritual path, I guess I have always tried to accept other people's opinions with knowing that I don't have to embrace them.
Right.
I just have to be respectful of them.
Yes.
And as far as I know, opinions aren't illegal as of yet. So I guess my point
it depends on where you are. If you are in seriously, if you are in parts of Europe, in Sweden, if you would express an anti-gay sentiment, you can be arrested. If I lived in Canada and this talk show was on the air in Canada, I would be in jail. Right now in the United States, we still have the legacy of a First Amendment, and when it comes to this subject, the gay lobby's trying to turn my worldview into a hate crime.
Understood, and I completely respect your opinion. I guess the thing I want you to know is that not all the people who are of the gay and lesbian population are flag wavers. We're not all activists. We just want to be treated fairly. I'm not even exactly, and this is going to get you a lot of comment, I'm not pro-gay marriage. I think we deserve equal rights, but marriage is not, in the parameters of how it's defined, we need to come up with something else to call it.
You just want to, just like most Americans and most people in general, you just want to be left alone, live your life.
Please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I want to know that if I'm dying or something happens to me, that my partner will have to be able to make the decisions that she can make, for my family, for my children.
Yeah.
So that I'm not out there saying not only do you have to accept this, but you have to make our cakes for our wedding. You have to be pro whatever my belief is in order for me to not assume that you're spewing hate.
Yes.
Phil never said anything hateful. He said his opinion, and he completely has that right to do that. You
and I are on exactly the same page about the whole thing. But I have to respond to the intrusions of the claims made by the gay lobby when they go to law, which is using coercion and force, to compel assent to a worldview that I don't accept, and I certainly don't want to subsidize.
Exactly.
And I expect the same response from you guys.
I just think that the people who are fighting so hard and so pushing their agenda, they're only making it worse for those of us who just want to live our lives.
Well, see, there's a component to this you may not understand, and this is not a mystery, and this is centuries old, and this has been observed before. If you'll, I know you're not a Christian, but there is a book, a book of First Peter is in the New Testament of the Bible.
I'm very well read in Christianity, so.
Well, all right. So here you have a fella talking to fellow Christians who are converts from paganism. And he has said, hey, you guys have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you don't join them in their reckless, wild living. So they heap abuse upon you. What is happening here, if in the case of Phil Robertson, or in anybody who is a genuine convert to the faith of Christianity, or a real Jew who is a Torah-observing Jew, their presence, the mere existence, is a repudiation of a lifestyle being practiced by pagans. And they feel they're being put down just by walking past you, because they know that you represent an objective standard they reject, and just your existence, it makes them feel judged and less than they. So, because that exists, they abuse those folks that make them feel less because they hold to a standard they don't. Now, that is as old as the Old Testament, old as the New Testament. It's old as human nature, and it's not going to change. Once we see that, you see this, I see this. The only way out of this dilemma is we stop using force to compel assent and agreement over areas where there is no middle ground. We stop trying to coerce each other, for Pete's sake.
There shouldn't be any coercion. There is, if you go through your life only going to people who are surrounding yourself with people who have your same opinions, you're going to be a very lonely person.
Absolutely. Well said. Hey, thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
You bet. It's 15 after 10. Mickelson here with you. Back in a moment. .org.
Dolls with boughs of holly. 'Tis the season to be jolly.
Kind of ironic now. This they Duck the Halls CD just came out a few days ago, and now Phil Robertson has been suspended. I'm going to change. You're going to think I'm changing the subject, but I'm not. This is how public opinion is manipulated. You and I were brought up to revere. Absolutely revere as an icon of virtue and righteousness and nobility, President Lincoln. I could get choked up listening to the Gettysburg Address. Why? Because I was programmed to. And that was before I was historically literate. It's easy to do that to kids. It's easy to do that to historically illiterate people. It's easy to get them to go along with the storyline, and we trust the adults who are serving it up because we're kids. Here's a premise. I think it's objectively true. I could easily demonstrate it, that Lincoln, in his time, was one of the most reviled and hated men to ever walk the face of the earth. By people in his own party, by people on the other side. I could spend the rest of the hour just demonstrating how reviled he was. I'm not going to do that. I don't have time. I can just give you a sample of this. Well, my point is, how do you get from that, the most unpopular person maybe who ever walked the face of the earth, to somebody that years later we revere? How did that happen? Did we understand history and better than they did? No, something happened. And I'll tell you what it was in just a second. There's a book called The Unpopular Mr. Lincoln. A guy named Larry Tagg wrote it. That he, in the premise of the book here, is that Lincoln was by far the most hated, reviled of all American presidents during his lifetime. After his death, Lincoln was turned into the kindly, grandfatherly, saintly figure that has been portrayed ever since. The makeover, writes Professor Tagg, explains was the work of the Republican Party propaganda machine with significant assistance from the New England clergy. Well, back then, the New England clergy were not Christians. They were Unitarians. They were still members. They had churches, but they had long left Orthodox Christianity, and they used their pulpits in order to advance a particular worldview. And they created the Lincoln, helped to create the Lincoln mythology. For instance, right across the river in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Democrat newspaper advocated assassinating Lincoln back in '64. That was before he was assassinated, obviously. They said if Abraham Lincoln should be reelected for another term of 4 years of such wretched administration, we hope that a bold hand will be found to plunge the dagger into the tyrant's heart for the public welfare. If we think the political discourse now by the mainstream media is tough and nasty and lacks civility, we just lack, again, another example of historical literacy here. Senator James Grimes, after Lincoln was assassinated. Grimes? That sounds familiar. Senator James Grimes. We have a Grimes, Iowa. Gee. All right, anyway. Yeah, he was named after that. Anyway, saying the party's propaganda campaign to deify Lincoln was so successful, it has made it impossible to speak the truth of Abraham Lincoln hereafter. These very same preachers who were reviling Lincoln just a few months before, they were reviling him because he wasn't moving fast enough on the slave issue for them. They argued that he was a big hypocrite. They attacked him for years. The very same people who had been criticizing him, after he got shot, heaped only praise on him, writes Tagg. And here's what they did. The Republican Party continued the thuggish tactics it had been using to intimidate the Northern public during the war. The Lincoln papers quickly realized if they didn't repent of their opposition to Lincoln, they risked ruin by mobs like the ones that had gutted their offices in the first summer of the war. The Republican Party's army of thugs did its best to censor free speech in the North as they had done during the war. An observer of the Lincoln funeral sent up a cheer for Jefferson Davis. One observer during the funeral, the mourners, cheered for Jefferson Davis, and he was overheard saying it, and the quote, set upon by the mourners, and they nearly tore him to pieces. A Chicago man was overheard in the lobby of a hotel, so, well, it served him right. And he was shot to death in front of dozens of witnesses, never arrested. Nobody would arrest the man who did the shooting. Americans were imprisoned all over the North for making similar statements. The doors of local jails now we're talking about the North, not the South here. The doors of the local jails rattled shut behind men in every city who had been heard exulting of the news of Lincoln's death. The editor of a Maryland newspaper was killed by a mob after he published criticism of Lincoln. Roving mobs of Republican Party thugs traveled from one opposition newspaper to another, as they'd done during the War of the North, emptied their contents into the streets amid the applause of an immense crowd. For several generations, media opposition to the Republican Party was rendered prostrate. So the Republican Party, cruising on the martyred and pretend martyred status of Lincoln, was allowed to squelch debate for generations. Ministers in the South were ordered by military occupiers during Reconstruction to deliver sermons deifying Lincoln. Many of the Southern newspapers were ordered to do the same. And to defy orders meant the terror of confiscation of their printing presses and imprisonment. So not surprisingly, there appeared sudden proclamations of Lincoln's nobility all over the South. This is how the Lincoln myth got invented. It explains why average Americans know nothing about the nation's most notorious president, because the awful fact of his assassination allowed the propaganda machine. We didn't invent propaganda in this generation. These people were smart. They knew how to do it. They're still playing the game. And the gay lobby has successfully used two different tactics in order to get where they are right now, so that the majority culture in this country is now being led around by the media and in activists by a small, statistically insignificant minority of sexual activists. How did they do it? And how do they continue to do this? What is going on with Robertson right now is an object lesson. Just like going to the newspaper and yanking these guys out and subjecting them to mob violence. It is exactly the same tactics. Exactly. You can and lose your livelihood if you besmirch the nobility of the gay lobby. We do have blasphemy laws in this culture. You can blaspheme God with impunity. But if you blaspheme the gay agenda, you will lose your job. So with guilt-mongering, with no logic, no science, no facts behind the aspirations of the gay lobby, they won, and they are intending, and they will continue to intimidate their critics mercilessly. That's why if you, the bed and breakfast people, if your thinking is violated by the notion of what you consider immoral behavior being hosted on your property, you must assent or you can lose your property. It is exactly what the roving mobs of Republican thugs did for a generation or two to clean up and turn one of the Abraham Lincoln into a saint. It worked. The guest I had on last week, Ileana Mercer, in her book Into the Cannibal's Pot, talked about it in slightly different terms. This is tying this back into what the guy from the Democrat Party said, who was the activist. He said, "I'm a twofer. I'm a double minority."
You know, Megan, as a double minority, I'm both gay and Jewish. I'm very sensitive to the plight of people who are persecuted for who they are or what they believe, particularly when it has a government stamp of approval. And
all right. So that's a double scam, by the way. The claims of double minority states is a double scam. And we were talking about the apartheid case, and we were following the death and the funeral of Mandela in South Africa. The parallels between what happened to the Dutch who'd built that country out of nothing over 3 centuries, and how they just signed it away and just gave it up. They just passed their country off to some communist thugs. They voted themselves off the island, gave up their property. And Ileana wondered about this. Why would they do this? And there is a chapter in her book, Into the Cannibal's Pot, that analyzes this phenomena. Keep in mind, Ileana is the daughter of a rabbi in South Africa. She's observing the total collapse of the Christian culture there and turning itself out of office and handing it over to atheist communist thugs. And she asks this question in her one of the chapters: why do WASP societies wither? WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That's the short, what that is all about. It says some clues why WASP societies tend to wither from within can be offered by de Klerk. Now, that's not the relation to the president. Puritans in Africa, he devotes energy to fleshing this out. He says the tragedy of the Afrikaner and the American is a function of their shared Calvinist Puritan ancestry, their struggle to reconcile pietism with power. Within the Calvinist Puritan ethic, they secretly yearn for power and find it impossible to do so openly and unashamedly. They have an ideal, survival, identity, fulfillment, and happiness, but it self-extinguishes. Multiculturalism at home threatens the United States and the West. Universalism abroad threatens the West and the world because it has a corresponding paradoxical, it means self-refuting, tendency. Puritans' tenderness culminates in national death wish. Mandating multiculturalism and mass immigration at home, and while pursuing monoculturalist manifest destiny elsewhere. Two sides of the same coin. And she writes about because she is a Jewish person, she writes about what they had in common with the Dutch. The Dutch had a high degree of affection for ancient Judaism and the law, and built their culture around the law, but they didn't know how to maintain it. He said the Hebrews, whom the American and Afrikaner settlers identified so strongly, are unburdened by pietism. Despite their political liberalism, the Jews of Israel are disinclined to turn the other cheek and apologize for their existence. The Israel in which I grew up believed almost universally that its cause was just and that an unjust world was conspiring against it. Besides which, Jews had centuries of practice as being a despised minority and see nothing new or nerve-wracking about existing in a state of antagonism with the world. The Jews do, however, appeal to Christian guilt when they're living as a minority in Western societies, and they may even take advantage of the way that Nietzsche once described of the special inclination that Christians have towards social guilt. Now listen to this part. Now this lady is saying, I know this is heady. I know this is really, really deep navel-gazing. But the lady's saying Christians have a wonderful worldview, and they have an aspirational worldview, and they want to build a culture, but after they got it done, they feel guilty about it. And they're easy to manipulate. So Jews are not easy to manipulate. They're used to being disenfranchised and being a disenfranchised minority. Christians build stuff, and then people who don't agree with their worldview, their freedoms, or anything about it, just want their stuff, come along and toy with their guilt glands to the point where they'll just give up. We didn't know we were bad. Here, take everything we own. That is a tactic that's used over and over and over against it. And the deracinated Jews use this here in the United States. And deracinated Jews in the United States are using their influence to play games with our guilt gland, dealing with the aspirations of the gay lobby. Using exactly the same tactics that are used everywhere. The same tactics that were used against South Africa to give up its land and its country. I think this is fascinating. The lady says, this is tactical, that Jews will use guilt against guilty, vulnerable Christians. It doesn't work against them, she says. In South Africa or any place else, you can't guilt out. You can't make a Jew feel guilty, especially if the Jew feels like his cause is just and virtuous. You cannot tamper with their guilt gland. They have it turned off. They understand the scam. But they say, the same Jews, when they come over here, will use the same tactic against Christians if it gives them a tactical majority or a tactical advantage. Writes Gottfried, he's the guy that's thinking in these terms. You see, the United States, he says they understand the special inclination of Christians have towards social guilt. This is mostly tactical, in the same way that patriarchal Hindus in the United States support the Democratic Party, as the more leftist and therefore less nativist of the two parties in an alien society. I'd even concede, Godfrey said, that many Jewish educators and journalists may by now half believe the leftist bilge they inflict on non-Jews, but the ideas they preach are totally extraneous to their Jewish identity. Again, back to the deracinated Jew. Severed from their own roots. I read all of this and said all of this so you can't get hustled. If you are a believer, you don't have any reason to feel guilt. Because using the standards of freedom and rule of law, we built one of the biggest and best standard civilizations ever existed. And it's being systematically deracinated by people with malice of forethought. And the gay lobby has been doing it successfully, using the scams of the co-scams of guilt and threats of violence. Now that you know, and you have the vocabulary, don't fall for it ever again.